There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn, the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another episode of Zooming In. A series, I keep calling it an occasional series, but it's just about twice a week, where I engage with bookish social media luminaries the world over to talk about interesting bookish or literary themed articles available to read online. And oh my God, have I got a special guest for this episode? This is Hannah of Hannah's Books. Hello, Hannah.
Hey, Shawn, thank you so much for having me.
Well, this is like having tea with the queen. I'm just booktube royalty in the Zoom room. How fabulous. And we're here to talk about a really interesting article that was published in the Atlantic magazine, I think the August 25th edition. I had a dickens of a time getting access to the full text. My library doesn't subscribe to the electronic version of it or whatever, but if you take out a free membership or whatever, if you log in ID for the Atlantic, you can read a certain number of articles a month, and that's how I got access to the full thing. And it's called "The Women Writers Who Destroyed Their Own Work" by Naomi Huffman. What a fascinating article. Hannah, take it away. What did you make of this?
Well, it was a really fascinating article. I had some issues with what the basic argument was, or if there was a basic argument exactly. It seemed like there were a variety of really fascinating stories, but I never really got a good sense of how they fit together. But I hope we can talk about some of the specifics.
Sure, and I would share that critique, actually, yes. And one of the issues I had is that I did a little bit, 5 minutes of additional research and found just as many, if not more, examples of male writers destroying their own work as females. So I'm not sure that there's a gendered thing, or maybe it is different for women than men, the motivations or whatever. But
I was wondering about that question too. I didn't do any research, but these were definitely women of a very specific time period as well. And I'd love to know how it worked across time as well as across gender.
yes, and I think she does a pretty good job of getting a diverse crowd of examples. Or I think there is three main examples, and there's so what the first one is contemporary of Marguerite Duras's Barbara Molinard. If sure I'm not pronouncing that right. Who
Have you
burned
read her
almost
book?
everything. I'd never heard of her.
It sounds fascinating.
Yes, it was Marguerite Duras and Molinard's husband who rescued what few stories didn't get burned by the author herself. And that book has just been published in English this year or last year, called Panic. And Sylvia Plath is the other one. She burned, they're not even exactly sure how much she burned, but this one was a little bit vague. Or maybe
It
nobody's
sounded
sure.
like
So
it was one particular moment, not
of
routine.
finding out about Ted Hughes's infidelity, and that maybe she burned a draft of her novel in progress, some of her husband's poems, "You Go Girl," um, and some
Or
other stuff.
correspondence with her mother. And it sounded like no
And
one knows what she wrote.
correspondence with the mother. That's right. And I had only maybe heard this next English novelist's name once or twice, Rosemary Tonks. Her story is quite different.
She was an author who had published a bit, but then had problems with her vision and also problems with her hands. And her vision was increasingly becoming problematic, so she had surgery. And then after she could see, she converted to Christianity because she felt like it was such a miracle, fundamentalist Christianity. And she basically disavowed her previous literature and thought that it was inappropriate and that the only thing worth reading was the Bible.
Which she would
My
stand
favorite.
on the corner and hand out free copies to people.
And
Yeah.
the way she got rid of her books was to go to libraries, check them out, and then burn them, which I thought was just not the most productive way to get rid of your papers.
Yeah, she sounds absolutely fascinating. Her fiction and poetry had been reflective of the kind of bohemian lifestyle she'd led up to that
Right,
point. So,
right.
quite a,
So unlike Sylvia Plath, and I think we should go back and talk about Molinard a little bit more in a little while. But unlike Sylvia Plath, what Tonks was doing was so radically different from being in a fit of anger, but instead changing her mind about what she had written before and not thinking that that represented her. And those are very different
Disavowing. It was a
experiences.
disavowal and a renunciation.
Yeah.
Whereas Sylvia Plath, it was a moment of fury and anger that possibly motivated that. And Ann Petry, I didn't know anything about her other than I've read her famous novel, but I didn't know any of this about her. She resented the way she was portrayed by the literary press, if I can put it that way. And so she just got very, very secretive. She was a Black American writer. She's famous for The Street, which came out in 1946, and she just couldn't stand the way she was covered as a writer, as a Black writer, as a Black female writer.
Again, her story seems so different that she's not getting rid of her work at all. What she's getting rid of is her personal papers, her journals, her letters. She doesn't want herself to be covered and remembered, which seems like a really different story from just drawing your books. That
I think
she,
it does too. I very much agree with your critique that these are all quite different, and I'm not sure that she has done a really good job of saying anything, to knit them together.
yeah, I think if the author had gone through and actually acknowledged that these are different ways, which I suspect she was thinking, given the way the conversations happen, the way the
Yeah.
essay flows, it might be different. I was thinking that the easiest way to tell the Molinard story might be to read it
Oh,
aloud from
please.
the Hoffman, the author
Yes.
of the essay. And she says, upon completing a story, Molinard would tear each page into pieces, which she piled on her desk and eventually pitched into the fire. And then she rewrote them. They were put back together, torn up again, and put back together again, is what Marguerite Duras said. And only the stories in Panic, which were rescued by Duras and Molinard's husband, were spared. And then at the very end of the essay, she goes on to say that Molinard seemed somewhat bewildered by her tendency towards destruction. She described a divided self. The part of her that destroyed her work was the enemy, and it was the shadowy other who ripped apart and burned her stories. So while I know that Sylvia Plath is depressed, that this seems like it wasn't fury, but true mental illness, since she was seeing herself as divided, as if the enemy is part of herself, which is different from rage.
It is, and there might be a way to talk about all of these disparate writers and their motivations using the word anger, but a slow burn versus kind of a state of fury. Like Tonks was kind of angry with her former self and wanted to renounce and have no and burn all the evidence of her previous hedonism or whatever. Although I'm not sure that my half-baked theory that I've given approximately 7 seconds of thought to fits for Ann Petry, does it? She was angry at her society, not at herself.
Which is another
She's
kind
the
of
one
anger.
that's
Yeah.
sure,
Yeah.
it is anger. Absolutely. Yes. If we just stick to using anger, sometimes directed outward, sometimes directed inward, then we can. It's a
Yeah.
little bit more baked.
I think that's right. I think that's a nice way to put it together.
I'm not sure about the gender thing. I found some really interesting examples in an article from LitHub, which I will link in the show notes from way back in 2020. And he talks about Proust, who it wasn't his manuscripts, other than it was his notebooks where he outlined In Search of Lost Time. He had those burned. Gogol was a bit similar to Rosemary Tonks, and you probably know all this. I didn't know it, but he found religion at the end of his life, and the ultra orthodox priest convinced him that what he had written was evil, so he burned part two of Dead Souls, and then
Wow.
died of starvation a few days later, 9 days later. Not sure. Did you know anything about that?
Nothing at all.
No.
And Huffman doesn't really make any explanation for why she chooses women, other than to say that, especially women perhaps in this period of the mid 20th century,
Yeah.
felt like they didn't have control of their own voices. But to a degree, once you put writing out in the world, I think all authors feel that way, or all public figures who have their words quoted back to them, even if they haven't published them, must feel that way.
So you are a writer. Have you ever burned any or destroyed any of your own writing?
I hadn't imagined you'd ask me this, but actually, yes, I have. I kept a diary from the time I was maybe 5 when I was first really learning how to write. And I used to, write down what we had for lunch in second grade or whatever. And I kept a diary, not literally every day, but pretty much daily through early graduate school. And then in history grad school, I was reading all of these collections of private family letters and private family journals or private individual journals and thought, I don't want people to go through and read, what I thought was just for me in years later. And so I burned them. But I keep a journal now. And I'm also writing some personal things right now. And I'm not sure how much I feel the need to protect it. Somehow, when you are writing it for public consumption, even if it's personal, it doesn't feel like the kind of violation that I think I would feel if historians years from now, looked at my random diaries from second grade.
So that is more akin to Ann Petry, right? We're not wanting her private stuff to be ever published or whatever, and that makes sense. I'm so much the opposite that I never burn anything. I mean, look at my house. You can't see the floor, but yeah, just trust me. I just don't ever throw anything out. So I have all my journals from way back. I don't know how happy my people that are left behind are going to be to read them. I probably should do something with them, but it
Donate them
won't
to an
be.
archive, and some historian will go through them, 60
Well,
years from now, 100 years
uh,
from now,
the part of Shawn
thinking,
the Book Maniac's life he didn't talk about in his Friday reads.
"Mhm,
There are other famous examples. Stephen King. What was his first novel? Shining? I can't remember what his first novel was, but he threw the manuscript in the trash and his wife rescued it. Otherwise,
wow."
that would have, yeah, that's a famous one.
And did he do it because he thought, oh, it wasn't any good? Or,
That's right. He had a kind of an attack of self doubt or whatever, self hatred. Kafka. What's the story on Kafka and his? Didn't he want nothing of his was published until after his death, and he got his best friend or whoever it was, cousin or brother, I'm not sure, but another man to promise him on his deathbed that he would destroy all of his writings. And whoever that was didn't honor the promise. Hence, we have the literature of Kafka. So,
well, I've been a little obsessed lately with Willa Cather, and she was very private about her letters, and she wanted all of her letters burned or destroyed in some other way after she died. And she asked people who had received her letters from her to do it. She also wanted to hold on to them until she died. And her partner agreed to do it and did get rid of a fair bit of her letters. She also left a codicil in her will saying that her letters couldn't be published. And so scholars for years looked through those letters that had been saved, but couldn't quote them so they could reference them. And apparently it got so silly that people, were debating and saying, no, really, this person didn't interpret it correctly. And it really has more of this indication, but they couldn't use the quotes to show it. So no, nothing was being hidden per se, although I suspect that might have been her goal, not to prevent the actual letters, but to prevent the topics. And part of it was because she had been in a long relationship with a woman. Actually, she
so I
had
was
two
just
long relationships, and she was probably, it was at a time when, lesbian identity was no longer part of the sort of 19th century romantic friendship situation. And so she felt like she was going to be judged for it, and she didn't want that to be how people remembered her.
the suppositions about why Proust burned his notebooks are that perhaps he was more out in whatever he was writing there that didn't go into. So yeah, that's certainly there would be kind of a whole subgroup of queer writers that might not want that were that lived closeted lives or whatever and wouldn't want that stuff to come out. So yeah.
Right.
Uh,
Well, Cather also, while I don't think she tried to destroy any of her published work, that she looked back on some of her earliest fiction and just didn't think of it as worthy. And so she frequently would apparently say things like, "Oh, Pioneers" was her first novel and or her first published writing, and it wasn't at all. But it was the first one that really created the Cather style. And so that idea of trying to craft how you're going to be remembered literarily was certainly
sure.
part of her thinking too.
So that's a little bit similar to Rosemary Tonks, isn't it?
Yeah.
Michael Cunningham, too, very similar. His first novel was called Golden States. And then after he'd gotten a couple more under his belt, he was just so ashamed of it that he would, anytime he saw a copy in a used bookstore or something, he would buy it and destroy it. I have a copy.
Wow,
Oh,
that's
oh, yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
That's
And
very cool.
I don't have the cajones to present it to him to be signed if I ever saw him again, but you could just probably
Take it
grab it
from
from
you
me and
and
tear it up,
throw it
tear it up.
away.
Now, there's another scenario that we haven't talked about that I actually support a writer destroying their work for this reason. There's several examples, and I don't think I have any of them in my head, but you can probably think of some, or the people watching can think of some, of writers who wanted drafts destroyed, unfinished stuff destroyed. And sometimes their requests were honored and sometimes they were not. And ultimately, it's almost all, I mean, we should have listened to the authors. Those shouldn't have been published typically. And
Yeah.
that's kind of a discrete motivation.
I don't
Who are
think I'd
some
want anyone
examples?
to know how terrible my first drafts are. I edit and edit and edit, and even short things, my first drafts are awful. And I, it doesn't feel like I'm not choosing to publish those. So the idea that someone would go through them, I mean, I understand that actually scholars probably are interested in the process of how people edit along and along, but
And so
I
thereby
wouldn't want
the writer completely loses control. I don't think we need to destroy this discussion. This was a really fun one, Hannah. Do you have anything
that.
more you'd
Thank
like to
you
say?
so much.
Yeah. Do you
I'd
have any
love to
more?
come back sometime. Um,
You standing offer. Thanks so much, Hannah.
Thank you.